Just take a look, it's in a book, a Canon rainbow.
How you get so big into food of this kind?
So I'm coming to you today with another kind of frequently asked question. I've done one of these before in the what order should I watch the Star Wars films. If you're interested in that, you can click there. But this is another question I get all the time. I want to get into the Star Wars book universe, and where should I start? First off, let me just put a little disclaimer that you don't have to start with books. You can absolutely start with comics. You can absolutely start with the Clone Wars or Rebels. You can even start with a video game. And funnily enough, those are all things I might talk about in the near future, so please don't discount those. But if we want to talk about novels specifically, I have a couple of ideas for you. Now, this used to be a lot more simple, but unfortunately now comes the question, do you want to read current canon or do you want to read Legends? And you're going to have people who try to talk you into either or both. And really, you shouldn't discount either one. I'm going to start with where you should start in current canon, but I will get to some ideas for Legends towards the end of the video. I'm just going to start with this. So the number one question I ask whenever somebody wants to know what they should read first is I ask, well, what about Star Wars interests you? Because that's going to change the answer to the question. If you got into Star Wars because of the Clone Wars, then I highly recommend starting with Dark Disciple by Christie Golden, which is based on unproduced scripts of Star Wars The Clone Wars. It was eventually going to become episodes, and it's fantastic. It's about Asajj Ventress and Quinlan Vos. Or you could read Ahsoka by E.K. Johnston, which follows Ahsoka after where we see her in the Clone Wars, but before we see her in Rebels. Now, if Rebels is what got you into Star Wars, then we have a couple of more options. Again, Ahsoka would be relevant. If you really like Rebels, though, I would highly recommend a series that we've talked a lot about on this channel called Star Wars Adventures in Wild Space. Don't let it being a kids' chapter series fool you. It's absolutely great. I read it just because I wanted to follow the tradition of kids' chapter books, because I read a lot of those that were Star Wars growing up, and I wasn't expecting a whole lot out of it, and it ended up being pretty darn fantastic, and it has a lot of great tie-ins to Rebels, so that might be a good thing for you to look at. If Rebels and Imperials are kind of more your game anyway, then I would recommend Battlefront Twilight Company or Battlefront 2 Inferno Squad. Don't let the titles confuse you. Twilight Company and Inferno Squad are very much their own novels. They're just called 1 and 2 because they're tie-in material to the games. You don't have to have played the games at all to appreciate them. If anything, they make the games better rather than the games making the books better. Except for maybe Inferno Squad, because you get to play as Inferno Squad in Battlefront 2. But these were also great reads, and you don't have to have like a whole lot of background information to get to know them. Also, if you're a Rebels fan, there's of course Thrawn, and recently released Thrawn Alliances, with Rebels being what brings Thrawn back. They're also really fantastic reads. Now, let's say you're not as into the new stuff, you're not as into the cartoons, the new movies haven't really been hitting you where it feels right, but Rogue One really spoke to you, then I highly recommend Catalyst. In fact, even if you didn't like Rogue One, I still recommend Catalyst, because I guarantee you'll like the movie better after having read this book. My experience watching Rogue One in the theater was greatly enhanced because I read it. It's all about Galen Erso and Orson Krennic and kind of their relationship going into Rogue One, which is something that I think really built the film, but was something that was kind of underplayed in the movie. I also recommend Rebel Rising by Beth Revis, who we actually interviewed on our blog site. We have a nice article interview with her that I can link to below. It follows the story of Jen pretty much from where she gets picked up in the opening scene of Rogue One into the rest of the movie Rogue One, and kind of follows her journey, and that's another great read. Also in the Rebels vein, there's A New Dawn. A New Dawn is the first canon novel released in this new canon, and it follows how Hera and Kanan met, and for any Kaneras out there, it's an absolute must. If Solo a Star Wars story is the thing that's kind of connecting you to Star Wars and what you're really interested in, there's Last Shot by Daniel Jose Older, which is really good. It's a story about Han and Lando and kind of their dynamic, and it kind of accentuates what you see in the movie between the two of them. There's also Most Wanted by Ray Carson, which personally I liked better than Last Shot, which is not to put down Last Shot in any way, but it was a lot of fun and it gave you a lot of backstory on Kira and young Han. Now, if the sequel trilogy is where it's at for you, then there's plenty you can read. There's the Aftermath series, which, funnily enough, if you were interested in that, I have a kind of a book club reading of the Aftermath series that I can also link to, that I highly recommend you check out. And it's kind of the launch out of Return of the Jedi before we get to The Force Awakens, and it kind of starts setting the framework for the aftermath of Return of the Jedi and just what happens. And it's one of the best things you can read to kind of get an idea of the galactic landscape post the destruction of the Empire. Now, if committing to 3 novels seems daunting, then there's also Bloodline. Bloodline is phenomenal. By Claudia Gray, it takes place 6 years before The Force Awakens, and if you were ever confused as to what the New Republic is, how it relates to the Resistance, why you should care that all those planets blew up in The Force Awakens, and where the First Order came from, Bloodline is the book for you to read. It's also one of the best Princess Leia novels out there. Speaking of Claudia Gray, 2 other kind of one-off books that you could read are Lost Stars, which follows a storyline from basically a couple of years before New Hope through the entire Star Wars trilogy to the Battle of Jakku, which is also in the Aftermath trilogy. And it's, star-crossed lovers, Romeo and Juliet in space in Star Wars, kind of gushy, romantic stuff. But it's also really good, even though that's not usually my cup of tea. I thoroughly enjoyed the novel. So if that is your cup of tea, you'll love it. And if it's not your cup of tea, don't let it fool you, because it's still a great book. Also, there's Leia, a Princess of Alderaan, which is about young Princess Leia. It adds a lot to The Last Jedi because it's where you meet young Amilyn Holdo, and it adds a lot to their friendship in the films. Also, if you want to stand alone, there's Captain Phasma. It's a great novel all about Gwendolyn Christie herself. Basically, I'm assuming it's an autobiography, and it's just a lot of fun. I've effectively mentioned almost every new canon novel. If I left one out, I'm sorry. But right now there's just a lot of good starting points, and it's kind of hard to tack down where the best starting point is because they're just kind of throwing you all over the place. Let's get into Legends now. Now, Legends gets a heck of a lot more complicated, so I'm probably not going to spend as much time on it. I highly encourage you to leave me a comment if you want to know where to start in Legends. Tell me a little bit about yourself or the person you're trying to recommend a book to. Tell me your favorite time period or their favorite time period, favorite character type, favorite film, favorite anything, any kind of information you can give me for some context. I'd be happy to help you with your kind of individual need. But generic starting places for Legends, unanimously, almost anyone will tell you to start with what's called the Thrawn Trilogy. It was, until the Disney buyout, the unofficial sequel trilogy when we didn't have a sequel trilogy. You don't need a lot of information. You don't need to know a whole lot about everything that goes on in the expanded universe. It's very, very accessible because it's one of the first things in all of this. It's not the first novel, but it was the first set of novels to kind of make Star Wars books really explode. Another good starting point, and I say this just because this was my starting point, this is how I got into Star Wars books. The first 2 Star Wars books I ever read were Star Wars Shatterpoint, a Clone Wars novel, and Star Wars Yoda, A Dark Rendezvous, a Clone Wars novel. These are standalone books. You don't need to know a whole lot else. You just need to know what the Clone Wars are. It doesn't really tie into the cartoon series at all because it came out before the cartoon series was a thing, but they're both great books about 2 of my favorite Jedi. So if you're into Jedi philosophy, these are really, really good places to start. Now, if you're a Darksider at heart and you don't care about the Jedi, the other kind of go-to starting place for the expanded universe is the Darth Bane trilogy. This follows the Sith that made the Rule of 2, which is the reason why there's only 2 Sith instead of thousands of them, just like there were so many Jedi. And it's very much a series from the bad guy's perspective, and it can really get at you if what you're more interested in is the evil of the galaxy. Another good starting point, and this is actually where I got one of my friends into starting off in Star Wars books, is the X-Wing novel series. The X-Wing novel series is not about Jedi, and it is not about Sith, it's about pilots. Just regular, ordinary pilots who go out and fight other regular, ordinary pilots, and they sit around in a bar and they play cards, and half of them end up sleeping with the other half, and it's just a rowdy, rowdy good time. It's really not a bad place to start either. It gets a little complicated because they tie in with their own comics sometimes, so every now and again a character will show up and everyone knows them and you don't. But just go with it. It's not really going to be a hindrance. You just kind of go like, okay, yeah, just the other unseen friend who's been there the whole time, sure. I'm actually going to pull the book out for this one. This is Star Wars Shadows of the Empire. Some of you might know this as the video game, but it was also a book as well as a comic adaptation. This is another good one. It takes place in between episodes 5 and 6 of Star Wars. Very accessible in that degree. And this deals a lot with criminal underworlds. if criminal underworlds are more your style. Alternatively, let's say you were really into Star Wars because you like the Knights of the Old Republic video games and or especially the MMO, The Old Republic. There's a lot of really good tie-in books, such as Fatal Alliance, which was the first one that they released. I really, really like these books a lot, and they kind of get into this whole other world of things. And the reason why these are good and why these are pretty accessible is they pretty much only involve each other because they take place so far before. These are thousands of years before the movies. The biggest issue with Legends, and the biggest issue with reading Legends novels, is they intertwine with each other so much. There's so many books where you kind of need to know other things that are going on in order to get into them, and that becomes kind of a sticking point, where it's harder to say, like, okay, well, you can read these, but there's going to be these characters and you don't know who they are. With the new canon books, we don't have that problem as much because they're kind of releasing all of these books sporadically as is. With the Star Wars Legends books, what happened was so many of them got released post Return of the Jedi. So you kind of need to read the Thrawn Trilogy to kind of know what's going on in the, Hand of Thrawn duology, and you certainly need to have read a whole bunch of stuff before you can even think about starting the New Jedi Order, and you need to finish the New Jedi Order before you can read Legacy of the Force, and you really should read Legacy of the Force before you read Fate of the Jedi, am I right? And it just becomes this really big complicated thing where there's all these books, but you really need to start here if you want to go here. So I think that's where I'm going to leave it. I know I was a little bit more heavy on new canon, but like I said, new canon's a little bit easier to pinpoint. Follow us on Twitter, visit port-haven.com for even more. Until next time, keep it real and fly casual.
Cooking candy